Good morning, all. The post-exilic prophet Zechariah and the Apostle Paul share at least one thing in common. They fostered a vision of the good city. In Zechariah 8 and in Acts 16, we encounter a vision and a strategy for locating and lifting up the footprints of God in the city. In between this vision of a city known for people who love God, Zechariah 8, and the execution of a holistic missional strategy, Acts 16, there are the words of Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew 5 through 7. These words provide for us the foundation and content to a godly city and a spirit-filled church. Urban Expression is an affiliate of Urban Expression, an urban mission and church planting agency in the United Kingdom, with other affiliates in Scandinavia and the Netherlands. Urban Expression North America is also a ministry of this congregation, Madison Street Church in Riverside. We currently church planting or missional church projects in 15 cities scattered across 7 states and 1 Canadian province. We relate to 6 different regional church bodies representing 3 historic Anabaptist denominations. We're blessed today that you're here and that others are still coming, and that there are folks online for this inaugural Urban Expression North America Conference. And we're blessed to have the 2 founders of the Urban Expression movement with us to celebrate this urban missional and Anabaptist effort. Dr. Stuart Murray lives in Bristol, UK, where he is joining us through Skype connection, solar flares permitting. He's the founder of Urban Expression and chair of the Anabaptist Network of the UK. Visa difficulties last week prevented Stuart from joining us in person, one of several mishaps during this week of final preparations. But we're grateful. He's offered to give up his evening in Bristol, probably a table tennis match got canceled or something, in order for him to speak to us this morning and this afternoon. Stuart's married to Sean. He has 2 grown sons and a couple of grandchildren now. Just 2, okay. Reverend Juliet Kilpin is a Baptist minister from Southend, UK, near the Thames Estuary. She's the director of Urban Expression in the UK. And that ministry is about to celebrate 15 years of service to the cities of Great Britain and beyond. And I assume Juliet will also say more about herself during the day because she's not very self-effacing or anything. No event like this is the effort of one person. A really great team has come together to make this possible. I would be remiss to not begin by thanking Debbie Wright, Director of Support Services for Urban Expression North America, for all of the behind-the-scenes efforts. Thanks, Deb. Steve Chris, my colleague from Philadelphia, who's going to be at the book table and will be happy to take your money for a number of titles, including not quite everything Stuart's written, but pretty close. Jeannie Berganti in the back from Madison Street Church filled in for us at the last moment when our caterer was suddenly hospitalized and unable to fulfill what we had hoped would happen there. So Jeannie, thank you for standing in. And special thanks to our partners in the Church of the Brethren, reaching across denominational lines, Stan Newig, the Director of Transforming Practices and Leadership Life Coach with the Church of the Brethren, and Inton Eller, IT man extraordinaire, have provided most of the marketing and all the IT muscle for this event. And thanks also to the sponsorship of Don Blues, the district executive here in the Pacific Southwest District, and Bishop Perry Engel, who we suspect is still on his way, the Brethren in Christ Regional Bishop, for their sponsorship for this event. Thanks also to you joining us out in the World Wide Web in 8 different locations: Pennsylvania, Ohio, Kansas, California, and other places. It's great to have you with us virtually in this way. Thanks also to the sisters and brothers from Madison Street Church who are joining us and who support this incarnational ministry of urban church planting with a lot of vision and good cheer, and allow me to often be away from the pulpit here in order to share values of discipleship, community, and reconciliation as a way of being church in far common places. Some announcements. Restrooms, if you have not yet found them here, go through that hallway, all the way to the back, and they are the 2 doors on the far left. There's coffee, and if donuts are your breakfast of choice, we have a couple boxes, so please help yourself. This is a very informal event. Get up, walk around as you need to. We would ask that you would do us a favor of turning off your cell phones. There's a limited amount of bandwidth, and we really wouldn't want yours to interfere with ours today. So there will be breaks, and you can return calls as needed. And as I mentioned earlier, there's a book table. Some of the books are on discount. Some are the publisher's price. We really invite you to take a look at those books with additional resources and make use of them. Are there other announcements that we need to make this morning? Deb, Jeannie, Steve, Stan, Benton? If not, would you join me in a word of prayer? Our God, we marvel at the technology that can come together in a short time to bring people from around the world to a little bitty building in Riverside to talk together about the issues of what your church is becoming and what it can be in the future that is unfolding before us. Thank you for the pioneering work of urban expression, the work that Stuart and Juliet have led so faithfully these years. As they lead us through a process of discovery today, may they agitate us and encourage us. And in spite of our own doubts and misconceptions, may they paint for us a picture of what your church can be in the future. Go with us this day. May we honor and glorify you in all that we say and do. In the way of Christ we pray. Amen. It's my privilege to welcome Juliet Kilpin in person and welcome Stuart Murray Williams virtually. And we'll look forward to your input for the day. The time is yours.
Thank you. Thanks very much, Jen. Well, it's fantastic to be here with you. Thank you very much for welcoming both Stuart and myself to be amongst you today. Stuart and I were supposed to be working together this week up in Fresno. We were supposed to be co-tutoring the course, and it's been very frustrating for Stuart not to be able to get through from Canada into the States this week. So, it's quite a feat of engineering that we managed to get things together here. But we hope it works really well for those of you who are here in Riverside and those of you who are watching online. We hope it works well. And we're really grateful for the guys who have been looking at the technical side of things and have managed to make it all work. So thank you very much for that. I live just about 40 miles east of London. I'm married to Jim. He's also a Baptist minister. Together we have 2 teenage children, and together the 3 of us, Jim, myself and Stuart, we oversee the work of urban expression in the UK. And urban expression to us seems like a very small urban mission agency which is still finding its feet, that is enabling a few creative things to happen, but is also learning lessons and making mistakes along the way. And I guess we find it fascinating that there are people in other nations that are looking to urban expression perhaps for a bit of inspiration, a little bit of permission giving, to try and do things differently. As Jeff said, we have urban expression teams in the Netherlands. We also have some work developing in Sweden, and there's work developing here in North America. And Jeff is the best one, probably later, to tell us a little bit about how things are developing here in North America as well. But we are delighted to be with you. And the topic for today is Changing World, Future Church, Ancient Past. And what we want to do for our time together here is to really explore what it is about our world that is changing so rapidly, to unpack what some of those things are, to ask questions about what that might mean for the future of the church, and what we need to be considering compared to that. And one of the distinctive elements, I guess, that we bring to it together collectively is that we look back to some ancient past. Perhaps not too ancient, but with our Anabaptist roots, and some of us are very clear Mennonite history, perhaps we bring that to the table. And certainly for Urban Expression, the Anabaptist story has been something that has resounded quite strongly with us. In fact, some people look at Urban Expression and they call us an Anabaptist church planting agency. We didn't set ourselves up that way, but that certainly seems to be what some people are suggesting we are. So what we're going to do is we're going to divide this first session up into several bits. I'm going to invite Stuart, first of all, to introduce us to something which may or may not be familiar with you, the phrase post-Christendom. Let me just do a hand count here in the room and riverside. For how many of you is the word post-Christendom familiar to you? Okay, so most of you are familiar with it. If I asked you to describe what it meant, I wonder how many of you would feel comfortable describing it. But I'm going to hand over to Stuart, who's going to give us a little insight into what post-Christendom is, and I'm going to follow that with a few stories that perhaps try and earth it into our context. Stuart, over to you.
Well, greetings from Bristol. Can I just check that you can hear me and that the people online can hear me, because I couldn't hear quite a bit of what Juliet was saying. I heard the first part, but the last few sentences disappeared altogether. I presume she handed over to me because she was pointing in the direction of the screen. But before I go any further, can I just get some reassurance from somebody that you can actually hear me?
Yeah, also, can someone stick to a mic so that Stuart can hear it?
They can hear now. We can hear you. Can you hear that?
Yeah, I can hear you. That's perfect. That's fine. Okay?
Stuart, I'll
You
just
can hear me, and I'll go ahead. I didn't want to be talking for half an hour and realise that I was talking to myself. It's happened before, but okay, and there's something about the reality of post-Christendom. I think I saw Juliet ask for a show of hands as to how many people were familiar with the word, and she smiled, so I'm assuming that there were several of you were, but I couldn't see the hands raised. So let me take nothing for granted. Post-Christendom is one of a number of words that cultural commentators are using to describe a period of culture shift that seems to be affecting all Western nations. I think it's worth saying at the outset, what we're talking about today is really related to the church in Western society. The story of the church in South and East is really very different. So this is by no means a global picture, but it seems to be a pretty common reality in Europe, in parts of North America, in Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, and so on. And it's one of a number of words that all begin with post and indicate transition. So post words point us backwards, they tell us where we used to be, and they tell us that we're no longer there. What they don't do is point us forward and give us any clarity about where we're going. So another very familiar word would be postmodern, which simply says there was a culture we called modernity, and much of that seems to be under threat or fragmenting. We don't know where it's going, so we now call it postmodern. Post-Christendom is that kind of word. It's relatively free of content, but it does say something quite specific about transition. So whenever you get one of these post words, you need to look backwards first and ask, well, what was it that we used to be and are no longer? And so we need to think a little bit about the concept of Christendom. Christendom is a word that should be fairly familiar to anybody coming from an Anabaptist denomination. It's becoming more and more familiar, I think, to many others, but it's been almost a kind of template for Anabaptists, and it's described a way of thinking about the role of the church in society that Anabaptists have been very uncomfortable with. The origins of Christendom were in the 4th century, when really very suddenly and unexpectedly the Emperor Constantine I decided that he wanted to align himself with the Christians, and he wanted to invite the church to Christianize what had been that pagan Roman Empire. I can find no indication anywhere in the writings of the early Christians before that they ever imagined such a thing to happen. I think it was an entirely by surprise and presented with a whole set of questions, challenges and opportunities. The Emperor invited them to join him in Christianizing the empire. He invited them to come in from the margins to the centre of society. He offered them all kinds of resources, favours, status, power, wealth, began huge building projects for facilities and churches. Suddenly everything was different. And there were a few voices that were raised in concern or protest, wondering what the implications would be for the church. But the majority of church leaders in the 4th century, perhaps very understandably, saw this as a God-given opportunity, a chance to Christianize the empire, to extend the meaning of the Lordship of Christ across all areas of culture. And they readily accepted Constantine's offer. Christendom took many centuries to develop. It didn't happen all at once, but it spread in terms of geography to most of Europe, and it became a culture of death. So the assumption was relatively soon that within the boundaries of Christendom, everybody, with very few exceptions, is now assumed to be Christian. So Christendom was in part a partnership between church and empire, in part it was a the area of private society, where what you believe and behave and where you belong were all subject to control. And it persisted for more than centuries, and in many ways it enabled Europe to escape the devastation that would otherwise have followed from the end of the Roman Empire. Christendom has many positive elements to it. And yet as historians have looked back, and particularly Anabaptist historians, they've wondered whether this was a big mistake, and whether actually the church should never have said yes to the emperor in the Rome. Whatever you think of that, it seems that Christendom world, that Christendom culture is beginning to disappear, or at least to unravel. The Christendom culture, the Christendom way of thinking is exported from Europe to other parts of the world, and to North America. Christendom is so in the US, of course, you have the formal separation of church and state, whereas in Europe you have state churches. What has emerged in the US? A very different form of Christendom. In fact, some people would say this isn't Christendom at all. This is quite different. It depends how you interpret the word, I guess. It seems to me that the US has a very powerful, if informal, expression of Christendom, which expresses itself as a form of civic religion, and that this particular form of Christendom may well last longer than the other forms of Christendom in other parts of Western culture. I certainly find when I'm in Australia or New Zealand, when I was recently in Canada, there isn't a huge amount of difference between the post-Christendom experience in Europe and the experience there. But I know from previous visits to the US that it does feel quite different there in many ways. Sometimes there is a real question raised as to whether the US is going to be an exception and not going to experience the same kind of transition from Christendom to post-Christendom. Well, time will tell. I certainly don't think it's happening anything like as fast in the US as elsewhere, but I do think, particularly in the urban centres, which is where urban expression is particularly interested and involved, there are many signs of post-Christendom emerging already. Let me just say a little bit about what I mean by post-Christendom, having looked back at Christendom. Whether you think Christendom is a good thing or a bad thing or some kind of mixture, it does really seem to be unravelling in lots of ways. When do we trace the beginnings of the end of Christendom, if you like? Well, I would probably go back to the 16th century, to the time when the Anabaptist movement was just developing, when this great monolithic Christendom that had dominated Europe for 1,000 years is fragmented through the Reformation into a number of mini-Christendoms. So you have Reformed Christendom, you have Lutheran Christendom. You have, of course, Catholic Christendom still, a bit later with Anglican Christendom, and these mini-Christendoms spent much of their energy trying to prove they were the right Christendom. And you have a century of religious warfare, which I think in many ways discredited the church throughout Europe and perhaps laid the foundations for rationalism and the Enlightenment and modernity. So Christendom, I think, has been on the way out for quite a long time, but it's been incredibly persistent, and there are still many vestiges of it in our cultures. But I do suggest that we are now reaching a point where Christendom is more of a memory than a reality in many places. In some places it's unravelling very fast, in other places it's pretty gradual. So in the UK it's been a gradual demise, happening over a period of decades, so slowly perhaps we've only very recently woken up to the implications. In other places it's happened rapidly. I was in Montreal a couple of years ago, and in Montreal the indicators of post-Christendom are incredibly fast. One of the indicators is the decline in church attendance. And leaders in Montreal told me that church attendance had gone from 25% of the population to 4% in a decade. And we've had nothing of that kind in the UK, and very little like that anywhere in Europe. And that presents a different set of issues when it happens very fast like that. But whether it's fast or slow, the trend seems to be in the same direction. Now, I'm hoping that you may have some handouts which will give you a one-sentence definition of post-Christendom and then a series of transitions. I don't know whether I can find any way of getting confirmation of that. Yeah. Otherwise, I'll just carry on and assume that you've got them somewhere.
I've got those.
Okay, I can hear something in the background. That was Juliet, so I'm assuming that that was a positive. The one-sentence definition is a little bit cumbersome, but it's an attempt to try to describe the reality that post-Christendom feels like and looks like in a number of places. Post-Christendom is the culture that emerges as the Christian faith loses coherence within a society that has been definitively shaped by the Christian story. And as the institutions that have been developed to express Christian convictions decline in influence. What that's saying is that our Western culture was largely shaped by the gospel story. There were other influences as well, and there are certainly questions as to how Christendom ever was, but the gospel story has been a foundational shaping influence within our culture. The problem we're facing is that story is known by fewer and fewer people and believed by fewer and fewer people. So the foundation on which our Western societies have been built is beginning to crumble. And as a result of that, we're looking in our Western societies for new stories, for new foundations, for new ways of agreeing together on how we live together as communities. And the various Christian institutions that were formed over the centuries as a result of that story are beginning to lose their influence. That includes the church, but it includes other Christian organisations and institutions as well. What you then have are 7 transitions, which are attempts to spell out in a bit more detail some of what this means in practice. Now let me speak from a British context, and you'll need to make any translation into the Californian context. In our context, certainly, the transition has been very strongly from the centre to the margins over quite a number of decades now. If you like, this is the reverse of the transition that took place in the 4th century when the church was invited to come in from the margins to the centre. We are now being gradually moved out from the centre to the margins. We're becoming a marginal community rather than one that really has a place at the centre of society. In some nations, including the UK, church still has a central ceremonial position, which you can see in royal weddings and coronations and a variety of other events like that. But in terms of its influence on everyday life, on politics, on foreign policy, on economics, on social issues and so on, it is becoming much more of a marginal community. Secondly, and these things all feed in together of course, a move from majority to minority. Within the Christendom world, we were the overwhelming majority of the population. You wouldn't ask anybody in Christendom, are you a Christian? The assumption, of course, was that you are. There were exceptions. There was the Jewish community, and we treated them pretty badly. There were some Muslims in the south of Europe, and particularly in Spain, there were occasions, there were periods of history when Christians and Jews and Muslims got on remarkably well together. There are some examples of ways of coexisting together, but they were exceptional periods, and quite often it was conflict rather than learning to live together. And there were always a few people who just did not believe anything. We might today call them atheists. They were usually called free thinkers in previous centuries. So there were minorities, and generally minorities did not fare well within Christendom. But the vast majority were assumed to be Christian. And that has changed significantly over the last few decades. The decline is measured in a variety of ways, whether it's a formal membership of churches or church attendance, or even loose connections to churches. But whatever figures you use, they're all declining. As I mentioned earlier, in some places that's very rapid, in other places it's been a much slower process. So much so that we've sort of got used to it and we're not alarmed by it in the way that we might have been if it was quicker. But we are waking up to the reality that we are now a minority community. And that is very different from being a majority community. The difficulty we're facing is that we have a majority complex. We are so used to being a majority, historically, that we're not quite sure what it means to be a minority. It's hundreds and hundreds of years since Christians in the West have been part of a minority culture. That, of course, is not true of other parts of the world. When the church went east out of Jerusalem rather than west, it found itself in a plural context and thrived as a minority community. There was never a Christendom in Asia. There were two occasions when it looked as if a Constantine-like figure might emerge, but it never happened. And so the Church of the East has a long history of being a minority community in a very complex situation. In many other parts of the world in the south today, the church is a minority. In many places a growing minority, but it's a very different environment from the majority that is Christendom. So we're not used to it, and one of the challenges we face, which perhaps we can pick up in the discussion later, is what does it mean to be a minority community, especially when we have a majority history. The third transition is from settlers to sojourners. We were very much at home in Christendom. It was our culture, shaped by our story, our language, our rhythms, our rituals, our symbols, our buildings. Everywhere you looked in Christendom, there were reminders of this Christian story. And so we felt at home. We felt this is our place, we belong here. The reality that is emerging in post-Christendom is we're not so sure that's true. There's enough around still in most places for us not to feel entirely alien, but we're not sure we're as at home as we used to be. The term sojourners is one way of translating a term that is used occasionally in the New Testament. It's the word paroikos, and a paroikos is often translated also as a resident alien, someone who lives in a particular city or state, but isn't fully at home there. They partly feel at home, but they partly feel they don't fully belong. Paroikos, that was the word that Peter used in his letter in the New Testament to address the Christians who were scattered across the Roman Empire. Very much a minority community. Might be living in Ephesus, but they didn't fully belong there. They belonged somewhere else. What I find interesting about this word paroikos, it's the word from which we get parishioner. And a parishioner is someone who belongs in the parish, fully belongs, in fact has rights in the parish. So somehow the resident alien in the Christendom years have become a resident, and any sense of not fully belonging seems to have disappeared. What I think we're going to see in post-Christendom is the return of the resident alien, the paroikos. We're going to find ourselves again in a situation where we're committed to the place we live, we're involved in a community, but we don't fully belong, and we sense that. The fourth transition is from privilege to plurality. One of the things we're going to have to get used to, if we're not already, is living in a plural society with many different religions, philosophies, ideologies. Now, of course, that was where the church began. The church began in a multi-everything society, where it spread east. It spread into a context where there were already major world faiths, and Christianity had to find its place among Zoroastrians, Buddhists, Hindus, later Muslims, and thrived for many centuries in that plural context. But in the West, all we really faced was a dying paganism. I think the reason Constantine was so interested in the church was that he really didn't think paganism had any future. The church seemed to be his best bet for holding his empire together. So apart from some of the rather strange mystery cults and a number of other things like that, really wasn't a great deal of opposition. The church just took over. And so, understandably, we had enormous privilege. A majority community with the emperor backing us. Yes, of course, there were enormous privileges for the church, which persisted for generations. And some of those persist into post-Christendom, into this transitional period. But not all of them. We are losing many of the privileges that we've been used to. I would suggest that in a plural society, it is entirely unjust for any community to have extensive privileges. One of the things I think we should welcome is the fact that other minority communities in Western cultures are now gaining privileges and rights and responsibilities alongside the formerly privileged church. I would suggest that for missional reasons, it is far better in a plural society for us all to be on a level playing field. No community, no minority enjoying privileges over others. But the difficulty we face is that means a significant loss of privilege for us. We're used to having privileges, and the temptation in many of our churches is to want to hold on to those privileges as long as possible. So we want Christianity to be privileged in teaching in the schools. We want there to be, in our context, bishops in the House of Lords, where that privilege is not given to leaders of any other religion. We want protection for Christian sensitivities, but we're not sure whether they should be extended to others, and so on. And I think within many of our churches there's a real sense of confusion, grief, even some anger, that we're losing some of the privileges that we've had in the past. And the temptation is to want to cling on to as many as possible for as long as possible. I'm not convinced that's a good strategy. I think for reasons of justice and for missional strategy, it might be far better to voluntarily move away from privilege, to give up privilege, and to support other minority communities in gaining a right place within our society. But that's going to require a significant amount of grace, and it seems counterintuitive to many in our churches. But we are beginning to face the reality of a plural culture. We are needing to learn how to relate to and share faith with Muslim and Hindu and Buddhist and Sikh and many other neighbours. And for many in our churches, that is still relatively new and a little bit scary. Other faiths we've known about, but mainly through missionaries who came from other parts of the world with reports of these very different people from us. Now we're finding that they're our friends, our neighbours, our workmates, and we need to learn to relate to them as individuals, as families, and as communities, rather than just some exotic reality in other parts of the world. That, I think, is presenting us with new opportunities and new challenges. It gives us all sorts of new possibilities, I think, in terms of understanding our faith and of learning from the experiences of others. And the fifth transition is from control to witness. As I mentioned earlier, Christendom is a controlled society, or was a controlled society, a society where there really wasn't a great deal of freedom to believe or to behave in ways that were not regarded as acceptable by the majority of society. And we're long past any ability to control what our society believes or does. We no longer have the power, we no longer have the right, we no longer have the freedom to do that. I, for one, celebrate that. I'm not sure we should ever have been doing that, but we certainly can't any longer. Which means that in terms of mission, we are thrown back on the much earlier, and I would suggest more authentic approach of being witnesses, of telling a story that actually many people no longer know, living by that story, by its values, by its principles, living in ways that are countercultural and that are good news within society, and inviting people on the basis of our witness to be followers of Jesus, to be those who embrace that story and also live by it. That's the only kind of influence that we can now exercise within our society. I would suggest that those 5 transitions, I know there are 2 more, but those first 5 are well underway in all Western societies, that they are inevitable, we're not going to find a way to avoid them, and that they are inexorable, there's no way back. We are on a journey into the reality that these things speak about. What you might want to do in the discussion time that is scheduled at some point this morning is to just ask perhaps 2 questions within your Californian context. How far advanced are these? Are some more advanced than others? And how do you feel about them? Do you feel negative, wishing it wasn't happening? Or do you feel positive? Do you see mainly challenges in this or opportunities? The final 2 are somewhat different from the others. From maintenance to mission and from institution to movement, represent not realities that we observe and then need to reflect on, but challenges that we face and choices that we face. The Christendom Church was massive. It was an enormous and very powerful institution. With the resources of empire behind it, it grew fat and it really did become a monster within Europe. Something like 1/3 of all the land in Europe was owned by the church in the Middle Ages. So power and wealth, status and control. It was a massive institution. It had a huge bureaucracy. It was incredibly costly. The only way in which the church could meet its bills was to impose this 10% tithe tax on the population, one of the most unpopular parts of Christendom, but nevertheless absolutely vital if the church was going to fund its enormous enterprise. So the Christendom Church was a huge institution, and it was primarily concerned with maintenance, with holding on to what we've got. If everybody around you is assumed to be Christian, with very few exceptions, there's little place really for evangelism. If you live in a society that is as Christian as it can possibly be, then there's really little prophetic role for the church. And so the emphasis is very much on maintenance. Christendom was dominated by pastors and teachers, and the role of evangelists and prophets and apostles just wasn't clear what role they had at all. People who seemed to have those sorts of pioneering, disturbing, troubling gifts were often sent off to the margins of Christendom to do mission somewhere else. Mission was fine as long as it took place a long way away from here, preferably in heathendom rather than Christendom. And so the emphasis was not on mission, it was on maintenance. Now, it seems to me that as we move out of Christendom into post-Christendom, we need to take a very serious look at the legacy in our churches and in our denominations. How much has the institution become dominant? And how much has maintenance been prioritized? Please hear me carefully. I'm not saying that we don't need institutional structures. No movement can survive for more than a generation without some kind of institutional structure. Nor am I saying that maintenance is a bad thing. We need to maintain and build and strengthen communities. The roles of pastors and teachers are very important. But if we continue to prioritize maintenance over mission, if we continue to think of the church as a great institution rather than a movement, I think we're in deep trouble. I don't think that we can thrive in post-Christendom if that's our paradigm. So I suggest that the transitions we need to make are towards movement and towards mission. But we need to refocus our attention on the mission to which God has called us. And we need to think about some of the practical implications in terms of what it means to be a movement. Are we flexible? Are we open to new possibilities? Are we making space for the pioneers? Can we reimagine ourselves and reinvent ourselves as a missionary movement? What would that mean in a congregation? What would that mean in a denomination? There's a variety of questions around that. And again, there might be something that in the discussion time you'd like to have a look at. So that's what I wanted to contribute at the beginning of today, to suggest that this is our emerging mission context, that it offers a mixture of challenges and opportunities, but it's a reality with which we need to deal. Let me stop there and come back to Juliet.
For that introduction to post-Christendom, let me just ask the group here in Riverside, are transitions that Stuart has highlighted, any of them in your context? The nodding heads here. And of those transitions, which one seems the most prevalent to you at the moment? Would you pick one out above the other? Particular? Yeah. We've got the microphone here. Let me just
privilege to plurality, I think, seems most prevalent in our culture. I think there is still a strong assumption that the dominant culture of Christians needs to be maintained and preserved in political and social life. And if you don't think that, there's something wrong with your faith.
That's a great example. Thank you very much. Anyone else? Any of those that strike you as more relevant in your context at the moment? Or would you agree that that's the main one? Actually, you've got a microphone right next to you. Do you want to just use that one?
I was going to add, I agree with the privilege to plurality reference, but I think I see an interesting tug of war there. I also believe that the entire world is rapidly experiencing an increasing gap between haves and have-nots. And so it's fascinating to see Christendom in its former privilege trying to hang on, because it really seems to relate all too well to the have part of that portion, while the rest of the world clearly is losing more and more access to resource, which then speaks, I think, from maintenance to mission, possibly.
Thank you. Thank you very much for that. That's a good point. Let me just check with the sound guys. Do you want me to use this microphone rather than the lapel? Is the lapel one working okay? This one seems to be better. I think I'll stick with this one. They're really helpful observations. Thank you very much. Let me just highlight perhaps a few of the things that this has changed, perhaps some of the issues it raises for us. And then I'm going to tell you a few stories. I'll get Stuart to tell us some stories as well. Stuart has a hobby of collecting post-Christendom stories. Stories which actually give example to this theory that we're talking about. And for some of you, maybe this has felt very theoretical, and we've used quite a lot of long words already this morning. I know it's very early for a Saturday morning to be using such long words. So we're going to earth those in some real stories. But let me just highlight perhaps some of the issues that this raises for us in this context as we go through these 7 transitions. One of the issues it raises for us is the fact that in our post-Christendom context, the story that we have relied so heavily on is becoming less and less known. And so, we possibly make huge assumptions about what people know and the starting point that they're beginning with, but actually the Christian story is far less known by many people than it used to be. And I'm sure you recognise that. I'm just going to introduce these quite briefly, and we can come back and revisit these in our conversations, and Stuart may have some other things to add to these. One of the other challenges is that our symbols are becoming less familiar. Again, things that we take for granted, things that we use to describe who we are, is becoming less familiar. You know, what the cross is, for example. What does that mean to people? What is this fish symbol that we keep putting on our car? What on earth is it? Why are there fish symbols all over the place? You know, I drove down from Fresno. I rented a car, came all the way down to Riverside, very proudly navigated the highway around LA and survived. I can do anything now. This is great. You know, and it just made me laugh, the number of fish symbols I could see on people's cars, and like with their business company names, as if you're going to pick their business to do work for you just because they have a fish symbol on their truck or something. So these symbols are becoming blurred for many people, and again, I mean, the language we use is just becoming mysterious to people. So language that we've relied on heavily, sin and judgment and justification. I don't know about you, but the only justification kind of I use on a day-to-day basis is on a Word document on my laptop. And I can justify it to the left or the right to the centre. Do you know, what on earth does it mean in our context? And I'm sure you can think of many other examples of words that just don't make sense anymore. And yet we try and hang on to them, perhaps because we're scared of experimenting with new words that would actually help people to understand what it means today. There are challenges about our buildings. Certainly in the UK anyway, many of our buildings are falling into disrepair. Many of them are being converted into for other use. Many of them are being knocked down. Our buildings that we consider to be very sacred are losing that status. And so there's a challenge of what do we do there? Do we re-sacralise these buildings? Or are we prepared to make other places sacred? Buildings that perhaps aren't normally deemed to be sacred, we might feel that we can harness that for that potential. Another factor is the fact that so often we have relied very heavily on this concept of conversion, the fact that people will reach a point where their lives change, and yet actually in this pluralistic, strange new world that we're in, the language of journey seems to be a language which makes a lot more sense to people. And of course people are starting that journey much further back than we have perhaps anticipated previously. So how do we cope in our churches when people are journeying at from different starting points, at different speeds? What does discipleship look like when it's difficult to say whether someone has completed a course, and that because they've completed a course that means they know this much information and therefore they're ready for, I don't know, baptism, church membership, responsibilities in the church? How do we quantify that when people are on this journey? We live in a global village, and this has contributed to the plurality that Stuart has mentioned, and this is only going to increase in many ways. I mean, not only just because of immigration and movement, but because the internet just blows the whole thing open. A friend of mine this morning, he proudly announced on Facebook, of course, that he's created a new word, and that new word is trochal. So it's the idea that because of social media, something global actually becomes something that you feel intrinsically linked with. And a lot of words connected with Twitter now have this TW at the beginning of it. So trochal, it's something beyond you, it's beyond your borders, it's something that's happening in another country, but because of social media, you are feeling like it's a local issue for you. And you're becoming galvanised and interested in it. Just fascinating, this global village that we're in increasingly. The fact that a decreasing church means that we're decreasing in resources. Certainly in the UK, this is a huge challenge for us. Statistics in the UK reveal that our church-going attendance is around about 6% at the moment. Now, I'm guessing that if you consider that some of those people have been counted twice, which is very easy to happen, so you take off a couple of percent for that, and then you consider how many of those people who go to church actually follow Jesus, you can maybe take off a little bit for that. So I suspect the number of people that follow Jesus in the UK is around about 4%. I wouldn't put it any higher than that. So not only does that re-emphasise the whole kind of marginal aspect of what it means to be a minority people group, but also it means that quite literally there's not as much money going around. And so patterns of evangelism, patterns of ministry that we previously relied on, we're having to ask serious questions about that. We can't afford to pay ministers, we can't afford to keep buildings, we can't afford to keep mission agencies going when they have huge overheads. So what's the solution to that? In the context of this, it's really important that attitude is relevant to this. Stuart talked about the fact that we perhaps still live as if we are in the majority, and we have an attitude that suggests that we're a majority. Maybe our attitude needs to change slightly if we feel like we're a minority. And those of you from an Anabaptist heritage, I'm preaching to the converted because you understand some of this sense and this history of being a minority, and you have found ways of adopting attitudes that help to cope with that are more humble and considerate, and that's key for us. And just recognising, the history that we have had before us, we have not always handled things well. And so again, this suggests that our attitude maybe needs to respond accordingly. But let us tell you a few stories that earth this in reality for you. I'll tell a couple, and then I'll get Stuart to tell one or two. Some of these I've actually stolen from Stuart anyway, but I'm sure he'll forgive me. So one of these stories involves the number square on the left here. Can any of you tell me what that is? Do you know what that is? A Rubik's Cube. It looks like a Rubik's Cube, doesn't it? It's actually called a magic square. Don't worry, I don't think it is actually magic. But it's on the side of the cathedral in Barcelona. And Stuart can correct me if I'm wrong about this. But the story goes that a group of students from the UK went to go and visit this cathedral in Barcelona. And the teacher was showing them around, and the guide was there showing them different things. And the guide pointed out this magic square. And what's magic about it is that whichever way you add up the numbers, it adds up to 33. Well done, we have a mathematician in the house. So every line adds up to 33. And apparently the guide introduced this in a very blasé way, because of course everybody would understand why it adds up to 33. And one of the students paused and asked, what's so important about 33? And so the guide, again, in quite a blasé kind of way, said, well, of course, that's the age Jesus was when he died. And the student paused and turned round and said, 33? Gosh, that's really young. What did he die of? Interesting, isn't it? True story. Absolutely true story. Another story, again stolen from Stuart, involves a checkbook and bank card here, and Stuart tells the story of someone going into a supermarket, and checkbooks are being phased out in the UK. You probably don't have them anymore here either. But you used to be able to go into the supermarket, into the store, and write a check out, and they would check your bank card to check that they matched. And so a minister, a female minister, went into the supermarket and she paid for her groceries with a checkbook. And the girl at the checkout got really confused because on the bank card, the lady's name was Mrs. and on the checkbook it was Rev. And so the girl turned round to her neighbour on the other checkout, who was a Muslim young lady, and she said, there's something wrong here. This lady, there's two different names, they don't match. On this one, her name is, Mrs. Kate whatever, but on this one, her name is Rev. They don't match, it's a different person. And so the Muslim checkout girl explained that Rev is the title given for a holy person, and that it was the same person. So a very interesting dynamic where you have a Muslim young lady explaining to a non-religious English girl the differences and interpreting things for her. Stuart, do you want to tell us a story about the Easter eggs? I like this story from the supermarket. Can you tell us that one?
There's a story from about 3 years ago when one of our major supermarket chains issued a press release about a week before Easter, which spent quite a bit of time telling us how many Easter eggs the British population was going to gorge itself on over the next week or so. A quite phenomenal amount of chocolate was going to be eaten. But it simply made the point that relatively few people who were eating these Easter eggs would know that there was any connection between the Easter egg and the birth of Jesus. 2 days later, a revised press release came out. They hadn't changed the number of Easter eggs that were going to be eaten, but they'd realised that they got something wrong in the first press release. And this time, they suggested that not that many people eating Easter eggs would know what the connection was between the Easter egg and the rebirth of Jesus. Well, getting a bit closer. 2 days later, so almost up to Good Friday now, and a third press release came out, this time making the connection between Easter and the resurrection of Jesus. But it had taken a bright 30-year-old graduate working in a PR firm 3 attempts to make the connection between Easter and resurrection.
That's great. Thanks very much, Stuart. And sticking with Easter, I'd like just to tell you a very recent story about pancakes. I know you guys, you have pancakes all the time, but for us, pancakes is a real special thing. Pancake Day, Shrove Tuesday, at the beginning of Lent, and we all go pancake crazy. And there's a fascinating docu-soap kind of programme which is really popular in the UK at the moment, called The Only Way is Essex, or TOWIE for short. And it's quite a funny kind of programme. It's a mixture of scripted commentary between this group of friends. You can tell some of it's a bit scripted, but some of it isn't. Some of it is just them living their lives out together. And for me, as somebody from Essex, it's quite painful to watch sometimes, because it isn't painting us in the best light at all. I don't know whether to laugh at it or whether to cry, to be honest. But it's a really interesting insight, actually, into contemporary British culture in lots of different ways, in terms of observing behaviour and lifestyle and attitude. But there's this wonderful episode around about Pancake Day, and you've got these 3 Essex girls with really, I don't have a very broad Essex accent, but they have a very broad Essex accent. And they're all in the kitchen making pancakes, and one of them asks one of the other girls, so Chloe, what's Pancake Day all about? And she just comes out with this great line, and she says, oh, it's something to do with Eid, which is a Muslim celebration. Eid, Yeed, Zen, Len. And this other girl says, you mean Lent, Chloe, it's Lent. And I just thought, how interesting. Actually, Eid is a Muslim celebration, so she's getting confused there. Zen is some spiritual mystic kind of understanding of religion, and she's working through all of these other options before she doesn't even know it's Lent. Someone else has to tell her what Lent is. They don't go on to unpack what Lent is all about. But just this plurality has created this confusion about Christian festivals that we take for granted, that of course people will understand what this is about. They don't understand. And for the final story, which is absolutely true, happened a few years ago now, and I overheard someone telling this story to somebody else in my locality. And what happened was that this particular lady, she was a mum of young children. She would walk her children to school, and this primary school had instigated a kind of a coffee morning occasion so that the parents, generally mums, could drop their young children off, go into one of the rooms at the school and to have coffee together, just as a way for the young parents to get to know one another so they can support each other. And each morning there would be about 25 of these young mums getting together, talking, chatting, drinking tea and coffee. And one of these mornings, one of their friends turned up a little bit late. And she had obviously just had one of those mornings, which all parents know about, which didn't go to plan. The children obviously were not behaving themselves. She finally managed to get them to school. She was looking a little bit flustered and got into this room to have a cup of coffee. And man hanging on this bit of wood was called Jesus. Out of this group of 25, there was one person who could say that had a name, and it was Jesus. For the rest, I mean, he could have been called anything. You know, think of all the numerous mystic names and gods that we hear about from different religions. It could have been any one of those. She didn't understand, and his name was Jesus. And I guess for us this raises heaps of challenges, but it also creates lots of opportunities. And I wonder whether it might be good just to get you thinking about this together for a little while, and then we'll come back and Stuart and I can hear back from you, and maybe we can respond to a few questions. But I'd love it if you could just get into groups and ask, what do you feel are the greatest hurdles and opportunities that arise from this post-Christendom context? Which hurdles or opportunities make you feel the most inspired, and which ones make you feel the most nervous? And if you get time to get to it, a third question would be, which hurdles have you seen best jumped, and which opportunities have you seen most creatively and effectively harnessed so far? So just before we break into groups, Stuart, is there anything you want to add just before we break into groups?
No, quite happy to group something. Okay,
Hang on, Stuart, we've just lost your sound there a moment. Let's just try again. Yeah, anything you want to add before we go into groups?
No, I'm very happy for the groups to have next, and we can come back on to later on if we need to.
That's great. Okay, I think Stuart's happy for us to go into groups. So, why don't we give you 20 minutes or so. Feel free to move the chairs around, have a chat with one another, get into groups of maybe 4 or 5 and ask yourself these questions. Those of you that are online, if you're in groups, you could do the same. Feel free to feed back some questions to us online, and we'll try do our best to respond to those shortly as well. So see you again in about 20 minutes. You've solved all the problems, have you? Yeah. Fantastic. Okay, friends, we have 30 minutes until we're going to break for lunch. So we have 30 minutes really just to explore some of this together. I trust that in the last 20 minutes you've solved all of these issues, and you've come up with solutions to all of them. So, you know, we don't even need this afternoon. You'll know what to do. So let's have a think then. What are the hurdles that make you feel most apprehensive, most nervous? Which ones make you feel the most inspired? So we've got some questions coming off the internet. Here we go. Let's have one of these.
Yes, this is from James Conister, and he says the challenge he faces is the church operating as a privileged group. The hurdle of awakening the existing church to this reality is overwhelming to the local pastor. How do we assist the traditional church to become missional? And then another question that follows later, how do we implant some of those change processes to help congregations move forward?
Yeah. So just a small question to begin. We can sort that out in 60 seconds. That's fine. I mean, it's a huge issue, isn't it? And for me, I think one of the challenges is helping people at local church level to understand the changes that are going on. You know, this is the kind of conversation we often have at theological colleges and seminaries and academic forums where we talk about these big words like post-Christendom, etc. But I'm sure that at local church level there are church members that understand that something has changed. They can see that the world is different, and they're trying to make these connections between church and the rest of their lives. And perhaps struggling when we don't really talk about these things in church, and that our sermons, as fantastic as they might be, are not really exploring these contextual issues. So, I think there's the challenge of helping our churches become aware of these things and not being scared of talking about them, but then also helping them to grapple with them at a deeper level. Often we like to behave a bit like an ostrich, where we put our head in the sand and we hope that this will all blow away, or at least I'll be able to cope while I'm the pastor here, and it will be the next pastor that can really pick this up. But in the meantime, as long as the church is going okay while I'm here, and the church is growing and stable and it's not declining, then I'm not going to pick up any of the flak for this. But actually, if we think about it responsibly, we know that this is only around the corner. And actually to begin thinking about it sooner rather than later is going to be a really helpful thing to do. I guess the question of how you transition a church is quite a challenge. I'll bring Stuart in on this in a moment, but I think for me, my observation is that in the UK, there are some churches and there are some denominations for whom the impact of these changes is so huge that they are now beginning to ask serious questions and to try and make serious changes. So the Anglican Church, for example, Church of England, several years ago, almost 10 years ago, pioneered something called fresh expression. That's a very popular phrase for us in England now, and it talks about how the Anglican churches and others, because they've jumped on board as well, are trying to enable churches to continue what they're doing, but also to enable other fresh expressions to start up alongside what's already existing. And it may be something as simple as doing church in a cafe or in a pub, or having donuts. That's quite radical for us. Obviously not for you guys. There are moves to try and explore these fresh expressions, which is a hopeful sign. But those denominations that are planning for their closure, because they can count the years off, that if they carry on at this rate of decline, they know it's only a period of switching the lights off in their last building. Those, I think they're responding much more practically, with slight panic. And there are those other denominations that are still cruising along okay, who perhaps don't feel this affects them quite so much. But Stuart, do you want to add anything to that about transitioning churches to be able to respond to some of these challenges?
I think I want to pick up first something you were just saying, Juliet, about the importance of talking about these issues in the local congregation, rather than just in leadership meetings or in theological colleges. I've talked quite a lot in local churches in different places about the transitions, so working through the same sort of material as we've looked at this morning. And I've seen lights go on all over the place. It's not that it's new, people very quickly recognise some of the changes which are taking place, but I think often haven't had a framework to understand what's going on and to make any kind of sense of it. And so I found the 7 transitions that I've used quite a useful tool in helping people to have the language to talk about what's happening, have some idea of the significance of the different things that they're aware of. So I think there is an educational process. I think as well it's going on beyond that to think about, as we are doing this morning, some of the opportunities as well as the challenges. This is clearly a challenging environment. There are new things we're facing, but there are also real opportunities. So just to pick up the other side of something Juliet said earlier, we're moving into a situation where growing numbers of particularly younger people really know nothing at all about the Jesus story. Now, that can seem very frightening to somebody in church who has known the story all their life and who just doesn't know where to start when confronted with somebody who knows nothing at all about it. On the other hand, in a situation where people know nothing at all, the Jesus story is incredibly fresh. And we're not faced with what we've been faced with for many decades, or even longer now, that the story is so familiar that people simply pass it by and not interested in having conversations about it. More and more in a post-Christendom world, we're encountering people who know nothing and who, when they discover just a little bit, get quite interested. Many of the post-Christendom stories that I collect are not examples of hostility or indifference, but of curiosity. People wanting to know a bit more about something that's unfamiliar. So I think it's partly just giving people a framework to understand, it's partly also helping people to see some of the real opportunities that there are in this post-Christendom environment. I think we also need to be realistic though. Juliet's talked about some of the denominations that are in real difficulty. There are at least 5 major denominations in Britain that are looking at ceasing to exist within 25 years. And certainly some of those, 2 or 3 of those at least, are beginning to take some quite radical action in order to explore new possibilities. And that's quite exciting. But I think we also need to be realistic that there are certainly some congregations faced with these challenges who really don't know what to do and may not be able to make the transition. I think we will be deceiving ourselves if we think that the whole of the church can make this transition to post-Christendom. I think many of the older churches around us are effectively in their last period of life. They are in their last generation. And rather than trying to force them into post-Christendom, in some situations it may be more appropriate, more gracious, to encourage them to complete the journey that they're on and stop. We're going to be talking this afternoon about church planting, but there is also church pruning. We don't, I think, have to be committed to every church lasting forever. It may well be that in some situations the best way forward is to help a church celebrate its journey, its history, and stop, rather than trying to force them into some new reality. Whereas in all situations, there are change processes. Again, we'll talk more about that this afternoon when we talk about church planting. But there are ways in which we can help congregations grapple with some of these challenges and begin to move forward.
That's great, thanks Stuart. I think for me one of the challenges about this whole education question for our churches is how to put this information in the hands of church members, actually. Because my experience is that us church ministers are often kind of the blockage in the process of communication, and we all like to read our academic books, and you know there might be lots of debate on blogs and on the internet about all of these ideas, but actually a lot of church members really can't be bothered with all of that conversation. They don't have the time for that, and so to write materials or just provide resources for people who aren't interested at that level, but at grassroots level they're really interested, and they are ultimately the people that are going to make a difference. They're the people that are going to be talking to their friends. They're the people that probably have more friends who are not Christians than the pastors anyway. These are the people that we need to equip in this day and age, really. But we'll come back to the topic of church planting this afternoon as one response to post-Christendom. So we'll come back to that. Any other thoughts then about the hurdles and the opportunities? What opportunities do we have? This isn't all bad news. There are some amazing opportunities. There's a microphone over here, or I can bring the microphone over to this side, if you wave at me. Hi.
Hi. One of the things we talked about in our group that tends to be most confusing to me in this post-Christian world is how to express what it really means to become a Christian. You cited the change in language from that of conversion to that of journeying. And part of that feels comfortable to me. Some of it feels very uncomfortable. And so I would be interested in hearing a little bit more about what conversion to Jesus Christ looks like in this new, brave world.
Yeah, that's a really good question. And thank you for your honesty about the fact that part of this makes you feel comfortable, but part of it doesn't. I think that's very true for many of us, especially as we perhaps experiment, trial out a few new ways of responding to people. I'll get Stuart to respond to this, because I know we have quite a lot of conversations about what it means to follow Jesus. I rarely, don't shoot me down for this, but I rarely go around calling myself a Christian anymore. It's not because I'm not a Christian, let me say that for the video, I am a Christian. But I don't feel very comfortable with that phrase because it's so loaded. And it just doesn't mean much to any of my friends or the people that I meet. The phrase that I use, which I'm much more comfortable with, is being a follower of Jesus. And for me that expresses something far more intentional about what I'm seeking to do. And it seems to make sense. But Stuart, you talk about this quite a lot, about the notion of following Jesus, but how does that fit into this idea of conversion? Is that an opportunity or a hurdle?
Let me come at this from two different angles. The first is simply to note quite a lot of research that's been done over the past 20 years or so into conversion and into how it is that people become either Christians or followers of Jesus, whatever language we want to use. The kind of classic revivalist language of conversion so often implies a kind of instantaneous experience, a very clear before and after. And for anyone whose conversion experience has been like that, it's quite difficult to imagine that there's any alternative. But the research suggests, and this is research that's been carried out globally, that a very significant proportion of people who would now very clearly say, I'm a Christian, I'm a follower of Jesus, it's not been instantaneous, it's been a process, it's been a journey. There may well have been crisis points in that journey, and I guess if really pushed, some people might say, well, if you want a crisis experience, perhaps it was in this place on that day. But if they're invited to tell their own story without kind of pressure to identify a date and a place, they don't use that sort of crisis language. They talk about a discovery, they talk about a journey, they talk about a process. And I think it's important we hear that and we don't force people into experiences that may be true of others but aren't authentic to them. I mean, the research suggests that only 1 in 3 people who have become Christians have this kind of crisis experience. Or 2 out of 3, they much more naturally describe it as journey. Now, that does raise some questions, and I think important theological and practical questions. It raises questions about where does baptism fit into that, which is an important Anabaptist question. At what point does someone express their faith in that way? It raises some theological questions about where are you on the journey, and what does that mean in terms of your relationship with Christ? But I think we have to grapple with this research and with the reality in many people's lives. The other way of coming at it is really just to draw on something which I think is very deep in the Anabaptist tradition. We're going to say more about the role of Anabaptism as a way of interpreting post-Christendom after lunch. But one of the features of early Anabaptist writings that I found very attractive is the language of journey, of following, or nakfolge in the texts. And what I find attractive about that is that to talk about following Jesus suggests both a direction. We are going somewhere. We're not just aimlessly wandering around. We are heading in a direction. We're following Jesus, but we're still on that journey. We're not yet at the destination. And I think that makes a significant difference in terms of tone and mood and the way we relate to one another, rather than the old model, which so often had a kind of implicit power dimension to it. I have all the answers, I have made it, and I now need to tell you what you need to do to make it and to get there. And the model is much more of, I'm on a journey, I'm following somebody, and I'm going in this direction. I haven't made it yet, I haven't got there, but this is the way I'm going. Do you want to join me on that journey? And so the image is much more of two people in friendship walking down the road side by side, shoulder to shoulder, rather than the kind of confrontational image that more traditional evangelism has. So I do think there are significant advantages in the journey language. We need to be careful we don't push it too far. We don't want to make people feel crises are somehow wrong. For some people, crisis conversion still happens. Nor do we want people to be endlessly searching and never feeling they've arrived anywhere. There's a real danger in that as well, I think. But provided we're careful in the way that we use the language, I think it can be tremendously helpful. And as well as being an Anabaptist emphasis, I would suggest that this language is deeply rooted in the New Testament. Quite a while before they were first called Christians, the disciples were known as the people of the way. If you look at the early chapters in Acts, it's the way rather than Christians. Christian comes later. So I don't think we're on dodgy ground here. I think using the language of journey, followers, fits in very much with this idea of being on the way. And I think it gets better into a postmodern, post-Christendom culture, where there is a real distaste, I think, for the kind of I'll tell you what you ought to believe type of methodology.
That's really helpful. Thank you very much, Stuart. We have another question from one of our online guests.
Yes, we have two questions coming up. The first one is, how does the New Testament inform us on how we relate to an unchristian culture? And then I'll have a second question after your response.
Okay. How does the New Testament help inform us on how to relate to an unchristian culture? To an unchristian culture. Stuart.
Juliet. Well, let me start by suggesting that actually there's some pretty useful resources in the Old Testament before we get to the New Testament. I will come back to the New Testament, but one of the things that I didn't say earlier but might have done is that many people are suggesting that the experience of post-Christendom has significant parallels with the exile of the Israelites in Babylon 6 centuries before Christ. And that if you look at the experience of the exiles in Babylon, if you look at the letter that Jeremiah writes to the exiles in Jeremiah 29, there are some very significant resources there to help us as we think through what it means to live in a culture that is alien to our own. Of course, it would have been a non-Jewish culture there rather than an unchristian culture, but I think there are some interesting parallels. So I think the book of Daniel, for example, is a really good resource for thinking through these sorts of issues. Daniel, as an exile in Babylon, faces all sorts of questions about how much to conform to this new situation and how much to resist it. He learns the language, but he refuses to eat the rich food from the king's table. You see him and his colleagues making choices in the first half of the book of Daniel. And I think there are some useful lessons in that. When Jeremiah writes to the exiles, he encourages them to settle down, to get to know Babylonian culture, to not withdraw and become confused or disorientated or frightened, but to get involved. And within that letter, there's the most remarkable challenge to seek shalom for the city of Babylon, the enemy city, the city that had devastated Jerusalem. Love your enemies, seek the best for Babylon. Why? Because, he says, in its shalom will be your shalom. You are now caught up with this culture. So I think it's really important, particularly for anybody from an Anabaptist tradition, where there is a persistent temptation to withdraw, to be separate, to not be involved. I think it's really important that we resist that temptation and interpret separatism not as some sort of withdrawal, but as learning to live counterculturally, making discerning judgments as to where we conform and where we resist and live differently. And I don't think it's any different in the New Testament. I think in the New Testament, if you look, for example, at the book of Acts, you see the disciples trying to work out how do they relate to the culture around them. Initially to the Jewish culture, which has rejected the Messiah, then to a Gentile culture, which doesn't quite know what to do with this rather strange sect. A number of incidents where Peter and Paul and the others have to engage with the authorities, and the basic position is clearly we must obey God rather than human beings. But what does that mean in practice? Paul at times seems to be quite happy to call on the authorities to do justice where he has been wronged. In other situations, the disciples willingly accept suffering because they are living by a different story. So I don't think there's a clear answer coming through from either testament in terms of this is what we should do in a post-Christendom world, but I think there are some very significant resources there. And I would suggest that we need to draw heavily on the literature of exile in a post-Christendom world, and that we need to draw afresh on the experience of the early church as a minority community, learning many of the lessons that we have forgotten and need to relearn them.
That's great. Thanks, Stuart. That's a very comprehensive answer. One book recommendation just to throw in is a book called Exiles. It's by a friend of ours, Mike Frost, who's in Australia, and it picks up this kind of this idea of how to live as exiles in a land which doesn't feel very familiar to us. So I thoroughly recommend that book on that theme. There was a follow-up question.
Yes, this is from our brother Hyun Her. He writes, our group of people are Korean. We've never been considered... Okay, this dropped away. Okay, we've never been Wait, oh, the question dropped out. Okay, hold on, right here. Coming back to it. All right. We've never been considered a Christendom country or church. However, we all agree that Korean church functions as a Christendom church. For example, we have many nominal Christians who attend local churches, yet do not want to follow Jesus' way of life. Would you want to ask Stuart what he thinks about churches in non-Western countries experience the Christendom symptoms?
Yeah. Absolutely. I mean, certainly for me, I think that's a really interesting observation.
I think, Juliet, you can answer as well.
No, I'm going to bat it to Stuart
We're
in a
not going to
minute.
distinguish here. Yeah.
No, I mean, I think it's very interesting to observe the consequences of the type of missionary work we have done in the past and see the effects of that. So there's a very interesting phenomenon for us in the UK, in London especially, that some of the fastest growing churches are African, from a variety of African nations. Some of our largest churches are African, and we give thanks to God for those churches, and many of the people that have come from Africa to settle in the UK sense something of God calling them to the UK in order to help re-evangelise the country that took them the good news. And it's we give thanks to God for those people because actually without their presence and without their engagement, seriously the church in the UK would be in an even worse position. And they're teaching us a huge amount. But it's really interesting because for some who are coming from Nigeria and Ghana and other places, they are coming and bringing the Christianity that we took to them, and then they're wondering why it's not working, because they assumed that that was how it was still in the UK. So there's lots of learning going on about that, but then it's interesting to look at some other nations and to see that we have taken Christendom there, and that is actually something that they are aspiring to. While we're beginning to see the collapse of it, and seeing the hurdles, but also the opportunities that come with that, there is a sense of observing Christendom emerging in new nations. And that's certainly an observation of mine. But Stuart, what else would you want to add to that?
I think one of the things that I've become increasingly clear about is that Christendom is a persistent and virulent virus that is able to mutate and reproduce itself in all kinds of new situations. So the kind of classic form of Christendom in Europe is not the only one by any means. I suggested earlier that the kind of informal Christendom that I see in the US is really quite a different kind, quite a different strand, if you like, of that. And I think there are other forms of Christendom that have emerged and are emerging in different parts of the world. I've never been to Korea. I have read quite a bit about the growth of the church in Korea and have some Korean friends who have talked about it. And it does seem to me that over the last 100 years, the way in which Christianity has taken roots in Korea can be described as some variant of Christendom at least. Not the formal sense, but many of the features are still there, and the ways in which the churches operate seem to me often to carry some of the kind of Christendom assumptions and values. So I think we need to recognise that although the official forms of Christendom are Western in origin, as Juliet was saying, it was that form of Christianity, it was the Christendom type of Christianity that was exported to other nations, including Korea, and therefore it's not surprising that that's what's taken place. And when Koreans and Africans and others come to the West, they often bring back a form of Christendom in their churches, which is no longer as prevalent in the West as it now is in some of the newer countries. I guess the other thing to say is that in some places, particularly in Africa, there is a desire in some churches and in some nations to create new forms of Christendom. Some of you may have come across a book by Philip Jenkins, the church historian, called the Next Christendom, which is a survey of global Christianity, particularly Christianity in the South, and suggesting that in a number of places there really is the prospect of new kinds of Christendom emerging as Christians, perhaps influenced by teaching they've got from the West, see the way forward as being to gain political power and influence, and they're looking to do that. And that's understandable. I mean, we've done that in the West, so why shouldn't other parts of the world go on the same journey? But I hope that there will be an openness to conversation so that we can talk about some of the downsides as well as the perceived upsides of that.
That's great. Thanks, Stuart. So questions there really about some of our approaches to mission and what we are encouraging people to aspire to as they learn to follow Jesus in their own context, and just being aware of the dangers, but also the opportunities we have. Of course, we want as many people as possible to discover Jesus and to follow him, but we also see the dangers of seeking the power and the influence and that becoming a priority above the day-to-day following Jesus. And I guess that happens in lots of different contexts, doesn't it? You have another question over here? Yeah. I just have to say, this side of the room, perhaps you're feeling marginalised because I'm holding onto your microphone. If you do want to ask anything, please just put your hand up and I'll be with you immediately.
Kind of referencing the paradigm of hurdles and opportunities that we were addressing in questions. I think something that really troubles me, and I'll even personalize it a little bit because I think part of this it comes from even my own personal experience with my children, who are now adult age. And it has to do with the privilege to plurality piece in some ways, especially the plurality. I believe that in postmodern society, there's an ethic of truth is in the eye of the beholder. And this sort of gets back to the question that Perry brought up about how does a Christian today give evidence of authentic faith? How is that expressed? What counts? And I think that the problem for me is trying to figure out how do we, as a body of believers and those who very much are confirmed in our faith, how do we communicate to those next generations where those lines are? And I'm wondering and would like some input on this, that I think ultimately it's going to jump back to expressions of faith communities, and how do we bring real, vibrant, alive faith community experiences next to postmoderns, or make it accessible to them so that it's not just a matter of a tenet of faith, but it becomes something that gets lived out. Was wondering if we could maybe talk a little bit about that.
Absolutely, that sounds like a great thing just to talk about. Let's dwell on this for a few moments, and then we're going to break for lunch just shortly. I mean, I just have a couple of responses to that. I'm just trying to find a slide. Well, you've got your list here of the transitions that we've been through, and one of the transitions is from control to witness. And I think one of the things post-Christendom gives us the opportunity for is really clearly witnessing to the truth that we believe. I don't think it calls for us to water down what we believe, or to be ashamed of what we believe, or to not feel that we can communicate what we believe, but it's perhaps the attitude with which we communicate that, and perhaps more of an acceptance that there are people who believe something very different, and they have every right to believe that, but we have a right to believe what we believe and to communicate that. So I certainly wouldn't say it's about holding that back, and I think for our next generation we need to be equipping them to be able to communicate clearly, with confidence in what they believe, but with a healthy attitude that doesn't put other people down because they don't believe the same, but is actually open to what they might learn from others. You know, if we believe that God has created all of us in his image, then dare we say that actually someone who believes something different to me, there is some potential for us to learn a bit from them. And, you know, for me, one of the Anabaptist values that I've gleaned is that of listening, of that of dialoguing, of that kind of whole conversational partner concept. And so perhaps we can equip the next generation to embrace that very well. And I think for me as well, one consideration is to really be equipping the next generation in understanding that they will be only one of many different ways of thinking. And perhaps in Christendom, we have a tendency to shield our children and our young people from different ways of thinking. You know, we don't want them to mix with certain people because that might broaden their horizons, and that might tempt them, and they might lose their faith. Often we do the same kind of thing. We have this inbuilt belief sometimes that, you know, Christians really should spend as much time as possible with other Christians, because if we spend too much time with people who aren't Christians, they're probably going to pull us away from Jesus. I mean, I don't know how strong your faith is now, but, you know, I'm seriously not worried about being pulled away from Jesus. But I'm seriously wanting to spend as much time as possible with friends that are not followers of Jesus, because otherwise there's no way they're going to find out. But we kind of have this tendency, and I would suggest that's a bit of a Christendom mentality. And actually, if we raise up our children and our young people with that idea, they're going to get an incredible shock when they go to college and they meet people who think differently, when they step into the real world and they meet people who are, you know, miles apart from them in terms of how they think, even about other Christian issues, let alone bigger issues. So for me, I think there's the two sides of that challenge of equipping people with the confidence to be able to communicate what they believe and to have every confidence that they own that for themselves, and they have every right to believe that. But to build the attitudes and the character that can communicate that with humility and love and respect for the other who is different, and to be open to the fact that even the one who is very different may still yet have something to teach us about this God who is bigger than all of us. So, I mean, that would be my response to what you said there. Stuart, do you want to add anything to that conversation?
Brief comments. Something about the power of stories. Again, something that I've really valued from the Anabaptist tradition is the power of stories to shape communities. And I think that a postmodern culture that reacts very badly to being told what to do is very open to stories. Stories are open-ended, they're not prescriptive, but they're tremendously powerful in shaping imagination. And I think part of what we need to be doing for the younger generation is to be telling stories. That may be Bible stories, but it may also be stories within our own traditions, stories within the global church, which demonstrates the realities of faith and Christian experience. So I do think it's, as I think Juliet was saying, it's about the way we teach rather than what we teach. I don't think trying to hammer ethical principles into our children or the next generation has much going for it in the cultural context we're in. But I do think telling stories, asking questions, encouraging younger people to think through the alternatives and possibilities. I think there are ways of teaching, there are ways of equipping, which are life-giving and liberating rather than feeling crushing. But I don't think we should underestimate the challenge of making disciples in what some people have called a disciple-making culture. So it's not as if we are trying to make disciples in a vacuum, in some sort of neutral zone. We are in a culture which is incredibly powerful and effective at catechizing us, at making disciples out of us. Huge amounts of money, for example, are invested in the advertising industry, which is all designed to make us client consumers, to tell us what we need and what we want, and what it will do for us, and how terrible it will be if we don't invest in this, whatever it is. And that bombards us and bombards our children, the next generation, all the time. And I think we need to think about ways of addressing that. And I'm not sure that most churches that I know do enough about with their presence. I think we underestimate the power of catechesis in our culture. One thing that I would like to do, I'm not currently responsible for leading a local congregation. If that changes, one of the things that I would like to do is to introduce a new liturgical resource. I would like to regularly play television adverts in the congregation as part of our worship experience and invite the congregation to deconstruct the advert, to do some theological reflection on it, to try and get behind what's really going on. What are the values here? One of the practices that I have is to engage very actively with television adverts. I don't know what you do when the adverts come on the television, whether you go make a cup of tea or put the mute button on or watch avidly or just ignore them. I have learned to engage with them. So when the adverts come on, I argue with them, I deconstruct them, I laugh at them, shout at them. Only my wife will know just how irritating I am to watch television with. But it does seem to me that we need to be proactive in the way that we engage with the disciple-making culture we're part of. This is not Christendom. This is not a culture with lots of support for Christian faith. It's a culture which has many different alien values. This is part of what it means to be resident aliens. And I think we need to really grapple with that. So I think the question that's been asked is a really important one. I don't think shutting up shop, trying to separate ourselves or the next generation from the realities around us is going to be helpful at all. I think that just creates dissonance and rebellion. But I do think that telling stories is important. I do think engaging in conversation with the very different cultural values around us and doing that openly with our children is certainly part of what we need to do. That's only a very short answer to a very important question.
That's great. Thank you very much, Stuart. I'm conscious there are some other questions coming from online, but I think we probably just need to draw to a close for lunch. You got time for just one more? Okay, let's go.
This will be our last question before our break. And the question is, this goes back to the transitions. The first 5 transitions all reflect a shift in power. How do you see a post-Christian church speaking to issues of power in the midst of cultures that seem addicted to power?
I mean, that's just huge. I think that does hit, that's kind of where the rubber hits the road in many senses, isn't it? This attraction that we have to power and the dangers of it. And again, I think for me, this is where the Anabaptist story has something considerable to say in the midst of all of this. That actually, it gives us a framework to respond to some of these transitions in a way that doesn't get too upset about losing power. I think we are very fearful of losing power. I think that's a real characteristic of the West. I think fear in general is a real characteristic of our behaviour at the moment in the West. Unfortunately, it seems that leaders with the darkest nightmares have the greatest control of their people. And so when one nightmare is sorted out, it's really not very long before another nightmare becomes apparent, because in order to control everybody, you have to have a nightmare to be able to protect everybody from that. And so I think, power is quite an addictive thing, and I think this is where Jesus gives us a model of how to resist that temptation. And so for me, a response to this, and also to the previous question, would be about, again, trying to earth our discipleship and our faith in a new and deep reconnection with the person of Jesus Christ. And that's not to throw out doctrine. That's not to say that doctrine isn't important. But doctrine is secondary to the person. Doctrine makes sense when we follow Jesus and we look at the life of Jesus. Doctrine without the life of Jesus is just a set of rules. So I can tell you off for not living by them. But actually, if together we're trying to understand the life of Jesus and to work out what Jesus would do, and not only what would he do, because that's difficult to envisage, isn't it? It's difficult to conceptualise what Jesus would do in 21st century Western society with some of the issues we're faced with. But to ask the question, what did Jesus do? And then to earth that into our reality. The more we know, well, what did Jesus do? How did he cope with this? What was his attitude? How did he resist these temptations of power, etc., etc.? Then it gives us a framework to be able to respond to that in this context. But I think the person online is absolutely right that most of these transitions are about letting go of power and embracing what comes after that. And perhaps that's what makes it quite a nerve-wracking option, really. Stuart, we're just going to head to lunch, but do you want to add any brief thoughts onto that before we break?
Again, 2 brief things. First of all, the move from the centre to the margins can so often seem to be a negative thing. If we're on the margins rather than at the centre, we don't have as much influence. Or, in the words of the question, we don't have as much power. 2 things on that. First of all, many people are saying that in a postmodern society, postmodern rather than post-Christendom, real change comes from the margins, not from the centre. And secondly, I think biblically, exactly the same is true. If you look at the biblical story, the significant advances in the mission of God seem to have taken place on the margins rather than the centre. And I think it may well be another one of these areas where our culture can be discipling us, catechizing us to think that the only way in which we can bring real change, the only way we can be effective, is to be in the centres of power and influence. If you remember, the disciples said to Jesus, Lord, you must go to Jerusalem because people need to see what you're doing. In other words, there's no point hanging around out in the villages and not in Nazareth. You need to be at the centres of power if you're going to make any difference. And that's really an echo of the temptations in the wilderness. So the disciples find themselves saying more or less exactly what the devil said, which is probably not a very good place for disciples to be. So it does seem to me we can see the shift from the centre to the margins not as negative, not as reducing our influence, but as lining us up with the context from which the mission of God often seems to go forward anyway. I think the other thing I'd say, and maybe something to think about over lunch if you want to continue this conversation, is we are now in Western culture an increasingly powerless community. Not entirely powerless by any means, but by comparison with where we were in Christendom, we are a marginal minority, one among many, relatively powerless. The question I'm often asked is, what if we became powerful again? What if the trends were reversed? What if in 50, 100 years' time, the church again becomes a very major component within Western society? What if there are huge experiences of church growth? What do we do then? What do we do if, rather than being 4 or 5 or 6% church attendance in the UK, we're at 55, 65%? How then do we act? And is there simply a likelihood that we would revert to some kind of Christendom? I guess my honest answer is, I think if that happened quickly, yes we would, and we'd make all the same mistakes over again. My hope is that we will be on the margins, in a minority for long enough, to really let go of the whole Christendom way of thinking, so that if we do at some point become a majority again, if we do again have the opportunity of exercising influence, we will do it differently. History is not on our side. Every time Christians have got into power, historically, we've done badly. Particularly, we have oppressed minorities with whom we disagree. I hope that we will be on the margins long enough and be reflecting deeply enough that there is at least a chance that if we ever get back in the position of power and authority again, we will do things differently. But it's going to take a while, I think.
I'm not sure there's ever been a time in history when people on the margins have been able to exert such influence for change. I mean, you just look at the Arab Spring. You just look at the phenomenon of the Coney 2012 video that's on the internet this week, which your guys in California have put out, hailed as a complete phenomenon of getting 40 million hits in 3 days. Never before has a YouTube video had that many hits. So a marginal voice actually has opportunities that it's never had previously. So I think actually, I mean, just to wrap up before we finish for lunch, I think as scary as these look and daunting as they might look, I think they offer us huge opportunities as well. They offer us an opportunity to rediscover what it is to be a marginal people, which you guys from your heritage have that. You have the foundations of that which you can reconnect with. It offers us opportunities to retell the story in new ways, opportunities to reimagine church for a new age. It offers us opportunities to respond to the speed of change. And actually, you know, that perhaps is a bit of a challenge, but things are happening so quickly. And we're going to look at church planting this afternoon. That might be one opportunity which enables us to respond quickly to some of these changes. And I think also, in the context of this, it offers us opportunities to reevaluate where our world is heading. One of the other changes that's been going on in the world is that we are now living in an urban majority world. And from 2008, the figures changed. So more people in our world live in cities than don't live in cities. For urban expression, that's a huge challenge, and in a sense, it emphasises why we're concerned especially about our urban populations, because if we are not working these things out, for an urban context, then we are putting effort into reaching a smaller and smaller proportion of our world. Not that those people don't need the gospel as much as everybody else, and we need ways that are going to connect with everybody. But if we are living in an increasingly urban environment, if we are not trying to work these questions out within that framework, we are in danger of becoming less and less effective at understanding our world and responding to it with the good news. So all of these things we need to look at with those lenses on. And I think Stuart mentioned earlier that actually most of these transitions we see happening first in our urban contexts. And so actually, to spend a bit of time in an urban situation, even if you're not going to be there long term, might help us to engage with these things and be a step ahead of the game in some of our other contexts, because this is going to happen whether we like it or not. So that's been great to have a conversation with you. I'm going to hand over to Jeff, who can let us know what's happening for lunch and when we should get back together.
Juliet, Stuart, thank you for the agitation and the provocative way in which you've helped us think about the future that is becoming in our midst. We're going to break for lunch. As you do, we've got sandwiches, salads, chips on a table back there, drinks in the narthex area. Please move quickly to that. We will reconvene promptly at 1 p.m. Pacific time. So you can keep eating while we start the next session, but we want to start right at 1 o'clock. If you do have a chance, as we've been talking about power, there's a book on the book table called Building a People of Power that discusses how to work at relational power versus the kind of unilateral power that Stuart and Juliet were reflecting on. And when we talk about culture of power, we're often talking about power upon rather than power with. And this book by Bob Linthicum that we carry would help unpack some of that for you. So take a look at that. Folks online, if you're interested in ordering it, send an email to viashalom@gmail.com. How's that for a shameless plug? Jeannie, Debbie, any announcements here? Okay, let's give thanks, say grace for the meal, and we'll adjourn until 1 p.m. Our God, we have been stirred in our imaginations this morning. We have seen a glimpse of the future, and we're not all quite sure what to do with that, except to trust you. So as we eat together here in Riverside and as other groups fellowship and have dialogue about what they've experienced this morning here, may your Spirit continue to agitate us, stir our imaginations, show us possibilities. Thank you for this meal. For those who have prepared it, we receive it as a gift from you. In the name of Christ. Amen. And we're